Wholesome elements of culture is the topic of today's talk by Mrs. Huti Watson.
Tēnā koutou ki te whare manatika o te ao, e whakahono nei a mātou I tēnei rā. Ki tō tātou matua te runanga wairua tapu o Aotearoa, tēnā koutou. O ti rā ki ngā iwi o Bahá'í o te motu, koutou ki rā wāhi hoki, tēnā koutou, kia ora tātou katoa. A lawa pā to the Bahá'ís of Aotearoa and those of other places who have joined us today. It's a beautiful day here and I'm honoured and blessed to be here among all the smiling faces this afternoon and to have gained so much from the enlightening talk this morning of Alison Milston, ngā mihi kia ia. I want to start by outlining a description about the world's Indigenous people as defined by the United Nations Special Rapporteur to the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities, Indigenous Communities, Peoples and Nations. Indigenous peoples are those which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of societies now prevailing in those territories or parts of them. They form at present non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identity as the basis of their continued existence as peoples in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions and legal systems. Indigenous peoples worldwide number between 300 to 500 million. They represent and care for 80% of the world's cultural and biological diversity. They occupy 20% of the world's land surface. The Indigenous peoples of the world are extraordinarily diverse. They live in nearly all the countries on all the continents of the world and across a wide spectrum of humanity, ranging from traditional hunter-gatherers and subsistence farmers to lawyers, academics and business people. In some countries, Indigenous peoples are the majority of their population. Others are minorities. They're largely concerned with preserving their lands, protecting their language and promoting their culture. Some Indigenous peoples strive to preserve traditional ways of life or to draw on traditional ways that give meaning to today's world, while others leave these behind in an effort to survive. Like all cultures and civilizations, Indigenous peoples are always adjusting and adapting to changes in the world. Indigenous peoples recognise their common plight and share a deep respect for the environment. Despite such extensive diversity in Indigenous communities throughout the world, all Indigenous peoples have one thing in common. They all share a history of injustice. Indigenous peoples have been killed, tortured and enslaved. In some cases, they've been the victims of genocide. They've been denied the right to participate in the governing processes of their state systems or their land taken from them. Conquest and colonisation have all but destroyed their societies and culture, or has impacted negatively upon them, resulting in the loss of their dignity and identity as Indigenous peoples. And the Māori of Aotearoa, tangata whenua, also share this common history with other Indigenous peoples of the world and continue to be engaged in similar struggles. According to a genetic trail, approximately 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, members of the Austronesian language group travelled south from Taiwan and passed through the Philippines and Indonesia, intermarrying with Papuans from whom emerged contemporary Polynesians who scattered across the Pacific Islands. So in effect, the Polynesians of the Pacific are one tribe, with branches of those groups voyaging to what is now known as Aotearoa, New Zealand. They became the original discoverers of this land that we all now call home, and the indigenous culture of Aotearoa is the Māori culture, which include our customs, cultural practices, and beliefs. We originated from and are still part of Eastern Polynesia. And unlike many other cultures in New Zealand, this is now the Māori cultural homeland, the genesis of Māori culture, and there is nowhere else in the world for Māori to express this. There is nowhere else to live and sustain our culture. As well as this, as descendants, many Māori feel they have a responsibility to their ancestors to uphold, express, and articulate Māori culture and values in modern society. So for those living close to their culture, it's never a case of only looking after and caring for oneself and one's immediate family. One always has to keep in mind the hapu, which is the extended family, and the iwi, which is the tribe. As explained, Māori society is made up of many hapu, and these are clans, each of which is made up of one or more whānau, extended families. Kinship is the bond that holds them together, both with a common founding ancestor and with the many members of their iwi, hapu and whānau. Sometimes we can mistakenly think that Māori are a homogenous group, but actually, while whakapapa, otherwise known as genealogy, while whakapapa connects us, the diversity that exists in culture, tikanga and language across the country is significant to no one else except ourselves. If our Bahá'í communities can gain an enhanced understanding of the needs, the culture and history, then reading the reality of a population will be much more effective and we can go deeper. So for the first slide, although the categorizations may seem limiting, for the purposes of this discussion, they can be roughly defined as falling into groupings, and we've given them names. So the first grouping is, I call it the traditional. And as you can see on the model, these are people who live more traditionally. They're more likely to live rurally and are highly concerned with maintaining the culture and principles, or tikanga, of Māori life and language, and with improving the social and economic conditions of their people. This is where the institution of the marae often lives, along with the tribal authority. People from the rural areas, particularly in native townships, are less concerned with European values and lifestyles. So you'll see on the screen the E, and that's a very small part of the life of the traditional person that the European lifestyle takes up. The next group are the adaptive group. This group is comfortable in the European setting. They're likely to be urban dwellers who may not have been able to maintain their links with culture and language as a result of the impacts of colonisation. In recent times, they may have become more involved as professionals with the tribes, but they've had little to do with rural or traditional lifestyles or settings. And you can see the T representing traditional in that model. The next group we call the emergents. The emergents are known as radicals. These people are often change agents who work to shift the nation's consciousness forward. They recognise the dire circumstances of Māori and are working to bring back those aspects of culture that strengthen the people. They also push back against the imposition of European values and lifestyles. And there's another group that we call tau wehe. These are people who have fallen through the gaps and don't feel comfortable in either world. They often come from parents who have moved to the cities to work, and the children no longer have the family networks to sustain them. Role models are lost to them, and sometimes they enter gangs and such. And the last group have emerged probably in just the last few decades, couple of decades, and we call this group Matato. Concurrent with the regeneration of the language, there's been an emergence of people who are culturally proficient and equally comfortable in Māori and European settings and lifestyle. Of course, there are many people who are the exception to the rule, but this gives a snapshot of just some of the realities of the groupings of our whānau Māori in Aotearoa. One of the distinguishing features of the last few decades of all of these groups has been the extent to which we have fought and worked hard to retain the language and maintain the culture. And a heightened understanding within the Bahá'í community about this phenomena is important if we are to not only attract but sustain adherence from these various groupings of whānau. Before we begin to talk about the main topic, to set the scene, I want to recount a passage from the selections from the writings of the Master, Abdul Baha, who explains with perfect clarity the principle of unity in diversity to us and elucidates its unifying force, which is none other than the Word of God. Abdul Baha says, "A critic may object, saying that peoples, races, tribes and communities of the world are of different and varied customs, habits, tastes, character, inclination and ideas, that opinions and thoughts are contrary to one another, and how therefore is it possible for real unity to be revealed and perfect accord among human souls to exist? In answer, we say that differences are of two kinds. One is the cause of annihilation and is like the antipathy existing among warring nations and conflicting tribes who seek each other's destruction, uprooting one another's families, depriving one another of rest and comfort, and unleashing carnage. The other kind, which is a token of diversity, is the essence of perfection and the cause of the appearance of the bestowals of the most glorious Lord. Consider the flowers of a garden, though differing in kind, colour, form and shape, yet inasmuch as they are refreshed by the waters of one spring, revived by the breath of one wind, invigorated by the rays of one sun, this diversity increaseth their charm and addeth unto their beauty. Thus, when that unifying force, the penetrating influence of the Word of God taketh effect, the difference of customs, manners, habits, ideas, opinions, and dispositions embellisheth the world of humanity." I had to look up to see what embellish means. To embellish is to make something more attractive by the addition of decorative details or features. And so this was the notion that Abdul Baha is trying to get across to us. And Abdul Baha continues, "This diversity, this difference is like the naturally created dissimilarity and variety of the limbs and organs of the whole body. For each one contributeth to the beauty, efficiency and perfection of the whole. When these different limbs and organs come under the influence of man's sovereign soul, and the soul's power pervadeth the limbs and members, veins and arteries of the body, then difference reinforceth harmony, diversity strengtheneth love, and multiplicity is the greatest factor for consideration." This is an incredible yet simple analogy. The soul as being the overall influencer that ensures the harmony of differences in the body. Abdul Baha continues, "Naught but the celestial potency of the Word of God, which ruleth and transcendeth the realities of all things, is capable of harmonizing the divergent thoughts, sentiments, ideas and convictions of the children of men. Verily, It is the penetrating power in all things, the mover of souls and the binder and regulator in the world of humanity. So likewise, as the soul is the overall influencer of the differences in the human body, the Word of God is the influencer that ensures the harmony of the diverse parts of humanity. This is a very, very profound passage, which I think pondering upon it is so essential if we want to learn more about the concept of unity and diversity. Abdul-Baha continues, "Praise be to God, today the splendour of the Word of God hath illumined every horizon, and from all sects, races, tribes, nations, and communities, souls have come together in the light of the Word, assembled, united and agreed in perfect harmony. Anyone attending these will be struck with amazement and might suppose that these souls are all of one land, one nationality, one community, one thought, one belief and one opinion. Whereas in fact one is an American, the other an African, one cometh from Asia and another from Europe. One is a native of India, another is from Turkestan. One is an Arab, another a Tajik, another a Persian, and yet another a Greek. Notwithstanding such diversity, they associate in perfect harmony and unity, love and freedom. They have one voice, one thought, and one purpose. Verily, this is from the penetrative power of the Word of God." The promotion of the principle of unity and diversity upholds the right to cultural identity, which also includes traditional and indigenous religious heritages and the theme that emphasizes the unity of humanity as well as valuing its diversity. This theme is repeated again and again, and these rights are so very important to Māori and indeed other indigenous people around the world in the present time. I'd like to share a series of reflections about some aspects of culture that might be helpful to keep in mind when working together with Māori populations. The first is the concept of aroha. Aroha is love in its broadest sense. It is an extension of manaakitanga, which is the expression of hospitality, concern for one's guests, respect, and the process of giving. Aroha doesn't expect anything in return. It's given freely and is done in service of others. The marae is a great example of service to humanity where aroha is freely given. The marae, for those who aren't familiar with this term, are communal ancestral meeting houses around which Māori communities gather to discuss community matters, and it's the main repository for the expression of culture and the Māori worldview. Many Māori are well practiced in service to others by serving on the marae. They're often raised on the marae, and they have been raised to learn to serve. Learning to care for large numbers of people is a matter of routine. They know the different roles and how to function as a team doing this. The people of the marae will always treat guests with a lot of aroha, but it shouldn't be taken to mean that one can become complacent. One must make effort to find out what the right behaviours or protocols are in these spaces. The next concept is one that we call hei whakamahana. This is the concept of bringing warmth and welcome to others. It rests on the concept that without elders on the marae is cold, and it's the elders' duty to ensure that the marae is not left cold. Similarly, in matters concerning Māori, ensuring that elders are part of community is very important, and they have a duty to watch over the younger ones. Separating or segmenting children and youth away from elders is not a normal state of affairs, as the Māori world is based on whānau, as I've mentioned earlier, families, hapu, the extended families, and iwi, which is the tribe. The elders maintain the fires of aroha for everyone. Kaumatua and kuia, the male and female elders, and in my tribe we call them pakeke. They should be respected and cared for and acknowledged. They are respected for their life experience, their knowledge and wise counsel, and are the keepers of the cultural knowledge, and they guide and guard the rangatahi in their development. Another reflection that might be helpful to share is that the notion of the principle of the oneness of humanity is a common understanding on the marae and among Māoridom. Sometimes assumptions can be made that because a people are focused on the retention of their culture, then they must not understand nor be concerned with this fundamental truth, which is not accurate. The practice of this principle is reflected in the orations and welcome on the marae, and the way in which people are treated as guests no matter who they are. The concept of the common humanity that is shared is also sung about, spoken about, and danced about. The notion that there's a common brotherhood with the rest of humanity is not something alien to Māoridom. It is crystal clear and certain. But, like many other Indigenous peoples, Māori have experienced the detrimental impacts of colonisation and, disillusioned, have turned back to their roots to find solace, strength and meaning in the principles and practices handed down by their ancestors. Consequently, they spend a lot of time doing this. The next reflection is about hui. Hui are gatherings where people come to the marae to consult. And consultation on the marae in many respects is very similar to Bahá'í consultation, in that it is, by and large, consensus consultation. It is respectful, with only one person speaking at a time, and everyone concerned has the opportunity to contribute. Generally, the kaumatua, or one running the hui, will summarise decisions. One aspect of staying on the marae is that it is at odds with Bahá'í principles, is the sharing of sleeping space by males and females. Baha'is cannot impose their rules onto the marae people, but they can, when making their own arrangements, ensure that this rule is observed by either booking a marae with 2 spaces or dividing the spaces available appropriately. The next kaupapa, or principle that I want to talk about, is te whare wānanga. Te whare wānanga is known as the Māori Houses of Learning. This institution of Māoridom is revered, and there are many such institutions with history hundreds of years old that still operate today, albeit a little less traditionally, such as Te Rawhioro and Tāpere Nui a Whātonga on the East Coast. These wānanga are overseen by the hapu and iwi that they belong to. They're characterised by elements that provide the core structure of the wānanga, such as whakapapa, the use of tikanga, or Māori values and practices, the presence of whānau, hapu and iwi, and the recitation of history. The whare wānanga of modern day are generally characterised by a mix of European and Māori education that maintains and advances the application of knowledge regarding āhuatanga Māori or Māori tradition, and according to tikanga Māori, the customs. And one other point to touch on. Cultural appropriation is a phenomenon where the adoption of elements of a culture are used by members of another culture or identity without appropriate discussions or agreements. This can be controversial, hurtful, and harmful, and is seen as a form of colonialism, especially when cultural elements are copied from a minority culture by members of a dominant culture and are used outside of their original cultural context, sometimes even against the expressly stated wishes of members of the originating culture. And I brought this subject up today, friends, to protect our Baha'i community so that we're aware of these kinds of issues that are being discussed in the public discourse. And finally, I come to our main topic, which is the wholesome aspects of Māori culture. What is wholesome? The meaning of wholesome is something that is conducive to or suggestive of good health and well-being. And how does one go about deciding what parts of one culture is wholesome and therefore can be fostered and encouraged? And what parts of it are contrary to the teachings of Baha'u'llah and should be let go? In this ever-changing world, there are many adjustments that are required while we're engaged in gradually bringing our lives into accordance with the very high standards set by Baha'u'llah. The struggle to decide what aspects of one's culture no longer serves us, when viewed in the light of his teachings, can be a difficult one. For it is hard to let go of concepts and practices that we hold dear to our hearts. But fortunately for us, there is guidance to help us to distinguish which category our cultural practices fall into. And we must engage in a process where we can scrutinize ourselves how and whether they are underpinned by spiritual principles or not. I'd like to share with you 3 excerpts from a telex dated 30th of July 1984, written by the Universal House of Justice to the Baha'i International Community, United Nations Office in New York, in a statement on the rights of Indigenous populations, and I'll make brief comments about them. The first excerpt reads, "While emphasizing the paramount importance of unity for mankind at this time, Baha'is also prize diversity in unity and appreciate the potential of each individual and group to contribute constructively to the well-being of human society. Rather than ignoring or advocating the suppression of the diversity of ethnical origins, of history, of language and tradition, of thought and habit that differentiate the peoples of the world, Baha'is affirm and respect them. Indigenous populations must have the fundamental right to develop and take pride in their identity, culture, and language." Always, the Universal House of Justice is urging us on towards the realization of the unity of humanity, and at the same time advise that Baha'is affirm and respect differences. And this can sometimes be difficult for people who live in societies like ours to learn to truly appreciate what this might require of us at this point in time. This is because we can mistake the idea of oneness as sameness, that when someone joins the faith, they will suddenly, for some reason, have no need of their cultural roots. And we may not appreciate what it means to them because we may not value what they value in quite the same way. And even if we do value their diversity, there is an even deeper nuance to someone's culture that we may never fully understand. But the Universal House of Justice guides the way and exhorts us to show respect and love to all the diverse peoples of the earth, regardless of the differences among us, and affirms at the same time that Indigenous populations must have the fundamental right to develop and take pride in their identity, culture, and language. And now I'm going to read the second excerpt of the letter. Baha'is confidently envisage the continuation of the process of social and cultural evolution, Therefore, while admiring and respecting the ancient traditions of Indigenous populations and the contribution they currently make to society, we anticipate that when all peoples have access to education based on spiritual principles and sound scientific thinking and information, the contributions of these peoples to the advancement of civilization will be greatly enhanced. Inevitably, some long-established traditions will be discarded as being in violation of common humanity, contrary to reason, divisive of society, or barriers to the efflorescence of the human spirit. But we believe that others should be actively fostered and perpetuated as living links with the past, as enrichments of the colourful diversity of mankind. In this excerpt, we read that there may be some long-established traditions that will be discarded. It's a fairly simple task to determine which ones will be discarded, as the guidance has been given. Firstly, they must not be in violation of common humanity. Common humanity involves recognition that all humans are the same in their basic needs and desire to avoid suffering. Secondly, they must not be contrary to reason. So some degree of common sense, logical and rational thought must be considered. And three, the traditions cannot be divisive of society nor hinder the growth of the human spirit. There will, however, be some traditions which will be actively fostered, and we need to think about who will make that decision. In some instances, it may be the institutions, especially if the practice is damaging to people or communities or contrary to the spirit of the faith, or for any of the other reasons mentioned. But by and large, the decisions will need to be made by the believers themselves, whose culture it is, and will be made naturally as they grow in service and consecration to the faith of Baha'u'llah. As sometimes the effect of forcing one's individual views on people may result in harm or withdrawal from the community. It can be particularly difficult when someone new to the faith may feel that the cultural spaces that they are comfortable in, or the norms that they've been accustomed to practicing, are not being appreciated by others. Or if there's an expectation for them to quit their cultural norms, or they don't feel comfortable to express who they are within the current context of the Baha'i community. And so the qualities of patience, love, and forbearance, as well as an appreciation of and respect for the many things we may not know or understand about others, become especially important in our daily interactions with these friends. And now I'm moving on to the third excerpt. Equally important is the right of the members of Indigenous populations to learn, speak, write and communicate in their native tongue, if they so wish, in addition to the official language of the country in which they reside. For language is the expression of the spirit of a people and the vehicle of its cohesive and inspiring traditions. So I'm going to read the third and final excerpt from the letter. Equally important is the right of the members of Indigenous populations to learn, speak, write and communicate in their native tongue, if they so wish, in addition to the official language of the country in which they reside. For language is the expression of the spirit of a people and the vehicle of its cohesive and inspiring traditions. Facility in one's native language, in addition to the official language of one's country, can produce an enrichment of the heritage of the entire people and can act as a stabilizing influence in society. While the cultural oppression which seeks to obliterate minority languages can have a deracinating and demoralizing effect that will be very difficult to correct. Furthermore, Baha'is advocate the development or adoption of an international auxiliary language by which all the peoples of all countries and cultural backgrounds will be able to communicate. An interesting part of this passage is that the House has said that facility in one's language can produce an enrichment of the heritage of the entire people and has a stabilizing influence in society. Enrichment is the action of improving or enhancing the quality or value of something. A stabilizing influence. Stabilizing is to make or become unlikely to change, fail, or decline. So these are profound words when you think about the many years of hard-won efforts to retain the language in Aotearoa. But the assessment of the Universal House of Justice presents here shows much deeper insights into the impact of the retention of that language than previously thought. And that completes my comments about the excerpts from that report. Now, I'd like you to close your eyes for a moment, everyone, everywhere here across Aotearoa who are watching this right now. So close your eyes, and as I read this passage, think for a moment about your own culture. This is from a letter written on behalf of the Universal House of Justice to an individual believer in 1989. And they say, "The aim of the Bahá'í faith is to maintain cultural diversity while promoting the unity of all peoples. This diversity will enrich human life in a peaceful world society. Within the Bahá'í community, the cultural traditions of the people who comprise it should be observed as long as those traditions are not contrary to the Bahá'í teachings." This passage highlights the principle that cultural traditions may be observed, but as long as they're not contrary to the Bahá'í teachings. So who has the responsibility to investigate those things that are contrary to the Bahá'í teachings? What things are there about your culture that are contrary to the Bahá'í teachings and that you might have to change? This leads to an analysis of one aspect of my culture, which is the traditional and formal process of welcome onto the marae. The pōhiri process is also known as pōwhiri, different dialects, but this is a fundamental feature of Māori society. It's often adapted and used in many other settings, including summer school. According to Hiwi Taurua, the marae is the place of the greatest mana and spirituality. It heightens people's dignity, where Māori custom is given the ultimate expression, and where Māori tikanga and ways of knowing, doing and being is fully practiced. The marae is the family home of generations of people who have gone on before. It is the standing place of the present generations, and the most distinguishing facet is the spirituality that underpins every part of the process. He says that the feeling of belonging cannot be adequately expressed in words, and that the spiritual feelings are akin to the expression of religious belief. Fulfillment is found in the deep sense of identity and connection in the mind and heart that is intangible, yet real. It is a place of comfort and source of great strength. Baha'u'llah says, "O well-beloved ones, the tabernacle of unity hath been raised. Regard ye not one another as strangers." On the marae, the purpose of the pōhiri is to bring together in unity two groups or more of people who might not otherwise know each other, strangers. And so the process is carefully designed to ensure that this is done with dignity and respect. So let's examine in a really basic way how this process plays out. And we can then make some assumptions about whether the pōhiri could be construed as contrary to the teachings of Baha'u'llah, or is it something that could be actively fostered? Remember, these are issues that Māori will ultimately decide for themselves, and indeed these conversations have already taken place over the years and are continuing. At the beginning of the pōhiri, the visiting group will assemble at the front entrance of the marae. Women will be assembled in front and men at the back to signify that the group come in peace. So the first coming together in unity is firstly a visual one. We can see each other. No word has been spoken as yet, but already the intention is clear. Those on the marae are assembled in welcome, with a woman waiting to call them onto the marae, and those at the gate are showing their peaceful intentions and indicating that they're ready to advance. Both groups are calling on those who have passed on to assist in the process. In more traditional times, and even today, a priest or kai karakia will stand at the back and begin to recite prayers. They pray to God, asking for protection. They call on the ancestors, our tipuna, or, as Bahá'ís call them, the concourse on high. They believe that the concourse on high, our tipuna, are meeting and joining together in unity at the same time that their descendants are doing. Now it's here that the Bahá'ís may also wish to offer prayers or designate someone to pray on their behalf. This is a process designed to facilitate spiritual connections, so all should take advantage of the opportunity to avail themselves of it. So what are the principles underpinning this process thus far? We see two groups coming together in unity, and there's prayer. We have an acknowledgement of the concourse on high by the kai karakia, the person praying. Following this, the first voice on the marae is that of a woman. The home woman begin a karanga, the call of welcome, which is made 3 times. Haere mai, haere mai, haere mai. Haere mai rā ngā manuhiri tuarangi o ngā hau e whā. Welcome to the distinguished visitors from the 4 winds. Haere mai, haere mai, haere mai. Welcome, welcome, 3 times welcome. And the kai karanga from the visiting group replies, karanga mai, karanga mai, karanga mai. Karanga mai kia mātou ko tai mai, ki te whakatai tā koutou pōhiri. Karanga mai, karanga mai, karanga mai. The reply to the welcome is in kind, and the woman may take this opportunity to exchange a range of words or statements between them. And really, in some respects, this is their opportunity to make their speeches. Now, this is where Bahá'í women, who are doing the karanga, may also introduce acknowledgements of the faith. They may speak of Baha'u'llah in their karanga. The marae is one of the most conducive places to teach the faith. And within the cultural constructs, there's great scope for this. Now, the verbal unification of these 2 groups have taken place. In the karanga, there may be an honouring of the local environment, the mountain, the river, and the marae that stands. All that is present is taken into account, and it is noteworthy that women are the first voice to be heard on the marae. The stirring call is beckoning the group onto the marae, and the advancing group reply, then stop, and they bow their heads in reverence to acknowledge their ancestors who are now consorting with each other in the spiritual realm. Is there anything thus far that is contrary to the Bahá'í teachings? Baha'u'llah says, cleave unto that which draweth you together and uniteth you. This verily is the most exalted word which the Mother Book hath sent down and revealed unto you. Following this, the home group will then call to them to be seated and the speeches of welcome will begin. It's usual for the home group to speak first, and for many tribes, it will be the men who speak on both sides, as the women have already spoken. This is where Baha'i men can introduce passages from the writings or prayers to commence their talks. This is an arena where they can openly proclaim the faith and discuss matters pertaining to it. There's been much debate about this practice of the men speaking and whether it's time for women to take their place as speakers on the marae. Given the Baha'i principle of the equality of men and women, this may be something for the Baha'is of the tribes to consider. Some tribes already have women who have held this role very capably in the past. But it's not usual for women to take on this role. And one reason is to protect women, as the marae courtyard or the marae atia is a place where the debate may become very frank and at times heated. This might be another aspect of the culture that Māori Baha'is might wish to consider, although I and no one else has the right to impose our thinking upon anyone. We're simply going through this process as an example to show how we can identify where changes might need to be made and to see what things can remain and continue to be fostered. So we have in this section of the pōhiri process two possible areas of change. But again, this is only my very limited perspective, and there may be others with more valid views. The speeches on both sides will generally contain references to those who have passed on, and one of the core reasons for the discussions is to find points of unity or connections with the visiting group, as well as discussion about the purpose of the visit. And often stories will be told about the connections between these groups, whether they are tribal connections, personal connections, family connections. Every connection that that group might have with the marae is explored and discussed and recounted. It's not usually acceptable to speak in English in this arena, but again, what do we see as the underpinning principles? Unity, connection, cordial relationships. Once the speech making has been completed, the group will sing songs, which are often songs of their home tribe, their history, narratives that contain recounts of events of bygone times. They can also be songs that are connecting the groups together. The songs sung can also be Baha'i prayers or songs pertaining to the faith. At the conclusion of this process, the visitors will be called to exchange the hongi, the pressing of noses as a symbol of the sharing of the mauri, the breath of life. This is a deeply sacred, symbolic way of greeting, although it may be strange to newcomers. It's a way of showing deep respect for Māori when greeting them. So at this point, the physical unity has been completed, and the visitors will be asked to share food. It's considered disrespectful if one does not partake of something to eat or drink, as the home group is showing manaakitanga, or care for their guests. So in this process, we looked at the areas where the pōhiri process is aligned with the teachings of the faith, and we discussed areas where it may not be completely aligned. But at this point in time, they're fairly minor issues, and if adjustments are to be made, they will be made by those using the protocols, and largely this means the Māori Friends. You can see, however, how deeply spiritual this process is, that it is underpinned by spiritual principles of the faith, and that it can facilitate rich opportunities to introduce the faith to the home people. So what does this mean for the three protagonists? That the movement of the Māori population towards Baha'u'llah within the parameters of the current framework for action is assured, is confirmed in the following passage from the Universal House of Justice. The Bahá'í community is engaging with Indigenous populations and other groups of people across the globe in an unfolding discourse centered on spiritual and social transformation. The Training Institute has proven to be a most effective instrument in this process, a process that has far-reaching implications. It carries with it an invitation to a higher consciousness of the purpose for which every individual human being was created. It implies a fundamental reorienting of a soul towards its creator, an awakening to the personal and social implications of the Guardian's statement that Baha'u'llah's revelation is calling into being a new race of men. The Blessed Beauty assures us all men shall be regarded as one soul. The efflorescence of those talents and abilities and their channeling into specific acts of service is a goal that the Training Institute aspires to achieve. As well as this, the National Assembly has indicated that solid community building activities amongst Māori families and young people are taking place across the country, incrementally building on strengths and carried out within the framework of the plan. It is hoped that the points that have been covered in this talk may support the vital efforts to strengthen the processes of community building and reinforce the Institute process, as well as help the Friends to increase the appreciation and understanding of the reality for Māori. Alao pā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko tō ingoa he whakaora mōku e tōku atua a te maumahara mō tōku rongoa. Te tata atu ki a koe tōku tūmanakotanga te aroha mō tōku hoa. Ko tō ngā kaua roha mai ki au tōku whakaora e tōku ho mai ora tanga I roto tahi I tēnei ao, ai te ao mo te haere mai. Ko koe koa te tino huhuatanga te matau ki ngā mea katoa, te tohunga ki ngā mea katoa. Kia ora.